between China and the West, stretching tensions to their limit in a diplomatic feud the likes of which haven't been seen since the Cold War. This tense rivalry between the world's two largest superpowers, the United States and China, has become a political struggle to shape the narrative of the pandemic and assert blame for the damage ravaging every corner of the globe, while trying desperately to dodge responsibility. Now, the US-China trade war has latched its tentacles around Australia as anti-China sentiment grows in the West. And there are legitimate fears the divide between the two will degenerate further when the pandemic eventually comes to a grinding halt. In this special report, Sky News explores the new conflict brewing between China and the West, and the global inquiry which could expose the early failures and cover-ups of the Chinese Communist Party and the World Health Organization. Backlash is building against China across the globe over its early mishandling of the outbreak, which helped unleash COVID-19 on the world, causing hundreds of thousands of deaths, millions of infections, the destruction of the global economy, and triggering a polarizing propaganda battle with the West to control the facts. China's foreign minister says his country and the West are being pushed to the brink of a new Cold War.
It has come to our attention that some political forces in the US are taking China-US relations hostage and pushing our two countries to the brink of a new Cold War. This dangerous attempt to turn back the wheel of history will undo the fruits of decades-long China-US cooperation, dampen America's own development prospects, and put world stability and prosperity in jeopardy.
We're seeing the return of great power contestation on a level that we haven't seen since the Cold War. We're seeing propaganda, we're seeing obfuscation, we're seeing the exercise of media manipulation and control of China's narrative and its own story in a way that speaks to a pretty adversarial approach that China is taking towards others.
As the virus spread around the world, China's attempts to bury the truth in domestic propaganda became more difficult. To remain in control, Beijing took its domestic tactics global, because making others look bad makes China's leaders look better at home.
Dictators fall, so they have to keep the public more or less on side. They can't get the public too offside, and the Chinese leadership understand that.
In a quest to counter Western accusations that coronavirus broke out at a wet market in Wuhan or escaped a biolab, Chinese diplomats have done away with diplomacy. Beijing's emissaries have replaced courtesy with intimidation. From whipping up conspiracy theories that the virus came from the US to threatening boycotts, it's clear China doesn't want anyone looking over its history.
This is what authoritarian regimes do. They execute broad-based strategic disinformation campaigns to deflect attention from their own failures. They do that so that the world won't see them, but they also do that to maintain power inside their own country so that their own people will continue to be subservient to the Communist Party itself. So disinformation campaigns like this, we've now seen campaigns where they're trying to blame the United States, Europe. I'm sure they've blamed Australia somewhere along the way as well.
It's been months since infections were first discovered in the Chinese city of Wuhan in late 2019. But there's still no certainty about the origin of the virus.
Here's what we know. This virus originated in Wuhan, China. And the Chinese Communist Party has rigorously prevented the entire world from knowing the precise origins. Who patient zero was, where they traveled, what actually happened inside the Wuhan Institute of Virology, how did this begin, how did this have the first human-to-human transmission. All of these things the world needs to know. We need to make sure that there have been elements put in place to prevent the next pandemic or the next 10 pandemics.
The World Health Assembly last week unanimously agreed to establish an inquiry into the COVID-19 pandemic.
and the resolution is therefore adopted.
The resolution, backed by more than 130 countries, calls for an impartial, independent, and comprehensive evaluation into the global response to the coronavirus pandemic. And it also focuses on the WHO's timelines pertaining to the COVID-19 pandemic.
What the Australian government have been arguing, that there should be an independent investigation into coronavirus and what's happened and how it's spread, was not surprisingly embraced by most of the world. And as a result of that, China had no choice but to go along with it.
Shortly after the resolution, the Global Times, which is a mouthpiece for the Communist Party, said the Chinese president stressed the need to strengthen defense. She said, "The epidemic has brought a profound impact on the global landscape and on China's security and development as well." He ordered the military to think about worst-case scenarios, scale up training and battle preparedness, promptly and effectively deal with all sorts of complex situations, and resolutely safeguard national sovereignty, security, and development interests. China has the second largest defense budget in the world, behind the US. This year, increasing it from $167 billion to $178 billion. Australia and the European Union led the push for this inquiry, which is set to begin at the earliest possible moment. Australia's Health Minister says establishing whether COVID-19 came from a lab or the wild is exactly why his government pushed for an inquiry.
This is precisely why we argued for an impartial and independent and comprehensive international evaluation.
Some see the resolution as a political defeat for Beijing, a triumph of smaller, like-minded nations, which threatens to expose a fraud in China and the WHO that eclipses COVID-19. Reports describe the investigation as independent, but it's too soon to know if the probe will be free from political pressure. President Xi said China backs a comprehensive review of the global response to coronavirus, but that it should be conducted by the WHO and only after the pandemic has passed.
China supports the idea of a comprehensive review of the global response to COVID-19 after it is brought under control, to sum up experience and address deficiencies. This work should be based on science and professionalism, led by the WHO and conducted in an objective and impartial manner.
The compromised WHO at the helm of the investigation could hijack the review and try to bury China's failures as well as its own. The WHO misled the world when it opposed travel bans on China. Despite evidence of human-to-human transmission, it praised Beijing for its transparency and delayed the declaration of a public health emergency of international concern until late January. China won a victory over the resolution's language, which includes no references to the country, but its cover-ups should inevitably surface, which could explain why it's so adamant no one should be punished for its spread.
上个世纪80年代，艾滋病首先在美国发现，并且蔓延至全世界，不知道给世界上多少人造成痛苦。有谁找美国追责了吗？
A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman said the resolution was a totally different thing from the so-called independent inquiry pushed by the Australian side. And the Chinese embassy in Canberra said, all those who know the consultation process that led to the resolution understand this. To claim the WHA's vindication of Australia's call is nothing but a joke.
Their ambassadors in a range of other countries have been doing the same sort of thing, not saying precisely the same thing, but they've been incredibly aggressive and rude.
Even if the Chinese Communist Party is uncooperative, the world already knows enough about its early failures to earn criticism in the inquiry. Unpublished government data obtained by the South China Morning Post found cases go back as early as November 17, weeks before the mysterious virus was first reported. China also allowed millions of people from the infection zone to leave and head around the world. It punished whistleblowers, cracked down on journalists, censored communication, destroyed virus samples, manipulated the narrative through the WHO, and underreported deaths by 50% in Wuhan.
We observed the actions of both the Chinese Communist Party and the World Health Organization from at least December through February of this year. They both tried to cover up what was going on. They knew they had information. They knew there was this risk. We saw them close down Hubei province but leave open flights to Milan and flights to Tehran, places both greatly impacted, flights to places like New York City, I'm sure Australia as well. That's not the nature of what good governments do. What governments are trying to protect and defend and secure do is they would alert the world. They would bring in the world's best experts to help them resolve the problem. They would make sure that the entire world had access to the virus samples, access to the laboratories, all the things that would be needed to keep people safe, and they chose not to do that and created enormous risk.
Beijing has rejected accusations it covered up the virus during the initial outbreak, as well as claims the virus might have leaked, or worse, been intentionally released from a biolab in Wuhan. While the Chinese Communist Party supports the inquiry into the pandemic, which is notably a backflip on its original position of repeatedly rejecting Australia's call for an inquiry into the origin of the virus, it has simultaneously attacked Australia, the United States, and other countries that have insisted on an investigation in the face of Beijing's resistance.
China, particularly under Xi Jinping, has become a lot more assertive, a lot more boldly nationalist. It has, without doubt, increased its territorial claims in really abrasive ways, and this has undoubted effects on China's image overseas.
China sees the inquiry as a political witch hunt engineered by Washington. But Australia's call for an independent investigation into the origin of the virus should have been a routine response to a pandemic. China has been furious with Australia's calls since April to examine the origin of the virus.
Wherever it would happen to be, it's important for public health globally that there is a transparency.
Enraged by Australia's prudent decision, China's ambassador to Australia infamously warned persisting could spark a Chinese consumer boycott of Australian education, tourism, and agriculture. China made an example of Australia for being the first country to make the call, starting with a threat. The Chinese public is frustrated, dismayed, and disappointed with what Australia is doing now, China's ambassador told the Australian Financial Review.
Maybe the ordinary people will see, why should we drink Australian wine, eat Australian beef?
Australia's foreign minister rejected that economic coercion was an appropriate response to Australia's call for a probe.
It's not an attack on China, and they never launched it as an attack on China. What China did was frankly quite disgraceful and beyond the pale in terms of diplomacy.
China has since taken steps to bully Australia for its inquiry, making sure consumers don't buy Australian goods by imposing an import ban in May on 4 Australian abattoirs and an 80% tariff on Australian barley, effectively obliterating the trade. While the Australian government is publicly dealing with the trade issues separately from the COVID-19 inquiry,
I think we have to be careful not to draw lines between these two things.
it's a mighty coincidence the beef and barley barriers took place just weeks after a threat from China's ambassador.
The Chinese Communist Party chose to threaten Australia with economic retribution for the simple act of asking for an independent inquiry into the origins of the virus.
It's not right.
And I think there is a good chance that China will do this again in relation to Australia.
The elimination of these commodities will create a tough road ahead, finding a new multi-billion-dollar market as large as China's to tap into.
We've tried to open up other markets, sending boats left and right when we have trouble with a particular market. But this is very late in the piece, shows that we don't have another major markets in which we could send our produce to.
China is very practiced at isolating countries, at punishing countries, at using incendiary language about countries. This is something that a whole long list of countries around the world have experienced over time.
Given the grand scale of the economic implications, Australia is prepared to take China to the World Trade Organization over the barley tariff.
We see no basis upon which they are justified, we see no basis upon which they ought to occur, and we will reserve all rights in terms of the types of appeals or other aspects of pursuing this further.
And the Morrison government is deeply concerned by China's actions, particularly given China has been ignoring calls from Australia's ministers desperate to resolve the trade disputes.
We hold concerns for the way this issue is being progressed at this point in time.
We have requested dialogue, and I have requested dialogue and discussions with my counterpart. We have not secured said meeting as yet.
We have moved into another phase of our relationship with China, and this is going to have really far-reaching material effects for this country. I don't think we can guarantee that the positive economic relationship we've had with China for such a long time is going to be unaffected by this, and it's certainly going to affect our ability to carry out creative diplomacy in our part of the world as well. Add on top of that we've got this kind of tit-for-tat sort of accusatory exchange, not only with the Chinese government, but with the Chinese embassy here. And the fact that Chinese ministers won't pick up the phone and talk to ours, I think, is a really concerning situation.
China fired another shot in the Global Times, warning it could go without Australian fossil fuels. It said, while China is the only choice for Australia's massive commodity exports, Australia is not necessarily the only option for China. There are also other countries, like Brazil, that can supply huge amounts of iron ore, coal, or LNG to China. The Global Times said Australia's call for an inquiry had exacerbated an already strained relationship. The relationship between China and Australia has been strained in recent years, it said, including but not limited to blocking Chinese takeovers of Australian businesses, banning Huawei's 5G network from entering its market on national security grounds, and a white paper urging an alliance with the US to contain China. Australia's recent attempt to appeal for the support of the US, Germany, and France of a so-called independent inquiry into the origin and spread of the COVID-19 outbreak has exacerbated the tensions between the two countries, casting a shadow over bilateral trade that is crucial to Australia's economy. Since the threat, the Chinese government has warned state-owned power utilities not to buy Australian coal and instead purchase domestic coal.
We are aware of informal quotas being imposed from time to time locally in China. That is not a new development that has happened in the past. It's been managed by Australian exporters in the past, and we'll continue to manage it into the future.
The Global Times described the relationship with Australia as moving towards its lowest point in decades.
Starting under Malcolm Turnbull, we've been demonising the Chinese and their system of governance.
The relationship with China has been going in a bad direction way before COVID-19 turned up.
Australia's parliament is fractured over China, torn into two sides. On one hand, you have those who want the commercial advantages China has to offer to shut up and take the money. On the other, are politicians who believe there's a line China should not be able to cross when it comes to the national interest. Some politicians have been floating the idea of retribution, including decoupling from China, banning foreign acquisition of critical assets, breaking China's 99-year lease on the port of Darwin, and hauling the Chinese ambassador before a parliamentary committee.
Well, they've got a 99-year lease. They should never have leased the Port of Darwin. And indeed, I started asking questions at estimates last year about the clauses, the get out of the contract clauses. And I think that the circumstances, particularly security circumstances, are such that we should seriously look at breaking that lease. And indeed, post-pandemic, it cannot be business as usual, and for that reason I have advocated for us to look at a plan to decouple from China to reduce the dependency that we have on the communist regime.
I'd be putting that on the bargaining table right now and say, hey guys, there's a clause in here, we can operate, and if we don't get the beef and barley back pronto and stop talking about any other industries, we can actually take some action of our own. Then it is a trade war. Unfortunately, that's where we're at.
Sentiment is on the side of these disgruntled, revenge-seeking politicians. Recent polling by the Lowy Institute revealed national sentiment towards China has grown colder, with 68% of Australians feeling less favourable to China's system of government. Only 31% believe China handled its COVID-19 crisis well. The US president and his Chinese counterpart had a cozy relationship until the pandemic. He hosted Xi at his Mar-a-Lago resort in 2017, who returned the favour during a state visit when Trump and the First Lady visited Beijing. Trump praised China's coronavirus response numerous times as the virus began spreading around the world. In one tweet, he said, "China has been working very hard to contain the coronavirus. The United States greatly appreciates their efforts and transparency. It will all work out well. In particular, on behalf of the American people, I want to thank President Xi." But that relationship quickly turned sour after the virus began wreaking havoc on the lives and work of Americans. It's the worst hit country in the world, which would explain why Trump is directing his outrage at China. Recently, Trump lashed out on Twitter, saying it was the incompetence of China and nothing else that did this mass worldwide killing.
We are not happy with China. We are not happy with that whole situation because we believe it could have been stopped at the source, it could have been stopped quickly, and it wouldn't have spread all over the world, and we think that should have happened.
He even floated the idea that a lab in Wuhan had accidentally unleashed the virus, and that China had falsified its COVID-19 numbers.
Do you think they're right numbers? Do you think China's giving the right number? I don't think so. I don't think so. Take a look at the numbers. They gave numbers that were so low. I mean, I saw more problem on television than they were reporting, just by looking at a picture.
The president has also threatened economic retaliation against Beijing, expressing interest in trying to sue China for damages, with the US seeking $10 million for every American death, and refusing to renegotiate the US-China Phase 1 trade deal.
I'm not interested. We signed a deal. I had heard that too. They'd like to reopen the trade talk to make it a better deal for them. So I make a great trade deal, and now I say, it just doesn't feel the same to me. The ink was barely dry, and the plague came over, and it doesn't feel the same to me. There are many things we could do. We could do things, we could cut off the whole relationship. Now, if you did, what would happen? You'd save $500 billion if you cut off the whole relationship.
Alan Dupont, a strategist and former foreign affairs advisor, said in an analysis, the linked US-China trade, technology, and geopolitical conflicts have precipitated a new Cold War. In an epoch-defining clash for global leadership. The world's two major superpowers are wrestling for strategic advantage in an increasingly bitter contest to determine which of them will be the preeminent state of the 21st century. Both countries have moved from a framework of cooperation to one of open rivalry and strategic competition. In a letter sent to the WHO Director General in May, Trump warned, if the WHO does not commit to major substantive improvements within the next 30 days, I will make my temporary freeze of US funding to the WHO permanent and reconsider our membership. Trump sees the WHO as complicit in failing to warn the international community about the pandemic.
The United States pays them $450 million a year. China pays them $38 million a year. And they're a puppet of China. They're China-centric, to put it nicer, but they're a puppet of China. And I think they've done a very, even when I did the ban, Mike remembers this very well. When I did the ban, they thought it was inappropriate to do. I did a ban very early. If I didn't do that ban, you would have lost hundreds of thousands of more people in this country. It was a very important ban.
I understand that Dr. Tedros' unusually close ties to Beijing started long before this current pandemic, and that's deeply troubling.
Trump's letter detailed numerous failings from the WHO, including bowing to Chinese pressure to delay the declaration of a global emergency, parroting claims COVID-19 could not spread between humans, and praising China for its transparency. Republicans supporting the Trump administration's hard anti-China stance have an appetite to use various tools, including sanctions, cancelling US debt obligations, and drawing up new trade policies to make clear to China and to everyone else where they feel responsibility lies. Missouri's Attorney General filed a lawsuit in federal court seeking to hold Beijing responsible for the outbreak to the tune of billions of dollars in damages. In March, the Trump administration restricted the number of Chinese citizens allowed to work for Chinese state media outlets in the US to 100. And a new rule announced by the US Department of Commerce requires foreign manufacturers using American chip-making equipment to get a license before being allowed to sell semiconductors to the Chinese telecommunications giant Huawei. The US is leading the rest of the West in a counter-crusade against Chinese Communist Party propaganda. After resisting pressure from the US for months, Prime Minister Boris Johnson is preparing to phase out the use of Huawei equipment and the UK's 5G network. Conservative Party members, concerned about foreign investment, have pushed to remove Huawei from the UK's 5G infrastructure and telecommunications network by 2023. In January, the UK decided to allow Huawei to play a role in its 5G network, but banned its involvement in the most sensitive parts and limited its involvement to 35%.
He's absolutely right to be concerned about investment, to be concerned about the buying up of UK technology now by countries that may not always may have ulterior motives, and we are certainly bringing forward measures to ensure that we protect our technological base.
And the US Secretary of State recently warned Australia that the US is prepared to disconnect if the state of Victoria's plans to sign up to China's Belt and Road Initiative negatively impacts telecommunications.
I don't know the nature of those projects precisely, but to the extent they have an adverse impact on our ability to protect telecommunications from our private citizens or security networks for our defense and intelligence communities, we will simply disconnect. We will simply separate. We're going to preserve trusted networks for important information. We hope our friends and partners and allies across the world, especially our Five Eyes partners like Australia, will do the same.
The wider West as well has cause to join Trump's hard anti-China stance. In Germany, In addition to new questions about the advisability of Huawei for new 5G systems, worries have grown about the dependency on China for vital materials and pharmaceuticals. And the Chinese embassy in Berlin sparred publicly with a German newspaper after the tabloid demanded billions in compensation from China for damages to Germany from the virus. France has been angered by Chinese diplomats too, including the suggestion the French had deliberately left their older residents to die in nursing homes, which prompted a rebuke from France's foreign minister. And in the Netherlands, China threatened to withhold medical aid for changing the name of its representative office in Taiwan to include the word Taipei. Given China's trade barriers on Australia and its aggression across the West, now could be a good time to know where countries stand.
The more China treats the rest of the world in the way they have been doing recently, the more those friends and those allies will come together.
In 1949, compelled by Soviet military aggression, the US and 11 other countries formed NATO, a security pact which regarded an attack on one as an attack on them all. Perhaps China's economic aggression requires the US and its allies to form a similar NATO-like alliance for trade. Philip Ritchie, Sky News.